All right, hello and welcome to this episode where we're going to continue our series on OCD and anxiety treatment and talk about how we justify anxiety. And so, this is kind of an interesting topic because this is something that anyone who deals with anxiety or OCD, this is something that everyone does, right? Is that we justify our behaviors that reinforce anxiety. What we do is that, ultimately our anxious minds, will create a thought, right? It'll create some kind of what if thought or, some potential threat. And then we do something in an attempt to try to control or neutralize that threat, right? And then what we do is because we neutralized it in our mind, the next time it comes up, we continue doing that and so on and so forth. And that's ultimately the cycle of anxiety, right? A good example of this could be the fear of flying. So, recently my family and I went down on a trip down to Mexico, and for a wedding, and we were flying back, right? And I ended up sitting next to this one gentleman, and we start talking, and he asked me what I do, and I'm like, I specialize in working with people with OCD and anxiety, and he starts asking me a little bit about it, and I tell him my story with dealing with it personally and how I kind of got into, working in this in general. And he starts telling me that he has this incredible fear of flying. Not usually the thing that you want to hear when you're on a flight with someone, right? No, I'm kidding. But at the end of the day, we start talking about it, right? And, and anytime I start telling someone that, used to be people always want to tell me all their fears and stuff, and which is fun, because it's cool to see people open up sometimes because often they've never told anyone. And so what happens is we're sitting on the flight, and he starts telling me about all these things he does before flying, right? And so one of the things was that I remember is that he has to wear a specific pair of shoes, right? And there's several other behaviors, but he wears these specific pair of shoes every time that he flies. And so I ask him, just directly, I'm like, okay, so if you don't wear those shoes, do you believe the plane is going to crash? And he says, well, no, I don't. But at the same time, he's like, I can't not wear them, right? And this is what happens. This is a good example of justifying anxiety and justifying living with anxiety, right? Because what happens with anxiety is that, in this situation specifically, is that when we do these certain behaviors to try to control a fear, and then that fear doesn't come true, we then falsely associate that because we did those behaviors, it prevented the fear from coming true. Okay, so let's look at the fear of flying, for example. If I had the rituals of wearing a specific pair of shoes and maybe even a shirt, and then I had to do 10 jumping jacks and chew a specific piece of bubble gum every time before I went on a plane, and then the plane didn't crash, my brain's going to make that connection regardless whether it's true or not, that because I did all that, the plane didn't crash, especially if I was really afraid of the plane crashing, right? Because that's what anxiety is, right? It comes up with this potential threat, and then we try to control it. And then if the threat doesn't happen, we think that what we did controlled it. Does that, hopefully that makes sense, right? Because, and we do this with anything, right? If we have the fear of getting fired, right? From work, and there's no evidence to suggest that we're going to get fired, and then we go and do all our emails throughout the night and make sure that our emails are perfect, and then we don't get fired, we make this false connection that, doing all that email work and all that extra stuff we did actually prevented me from getting fired, when the reality was it was never going to happen in the first place, right? Most likely. And that's how we make the justification for living with anxiety, right? Our brain comes up with these potential threats, and we do these safety behaviors, and we do them more and more and more because it usually builds and builds and builds. And because the thing that we're afraid of doesn't happen, we keep doing them. And that was what I asked him. I said, well, if you just didn't wear these shoes on your next flight, and we talked about what would happen, right? Well, what would happen is odds are the plane would take off and it would land, right? And then his brain would learn that the shoes never kept him safe. And that's like the greatest part about, working with people. When I get the opportunity to work with people on, with exposures and all that stuff, it's my favorite thing, because so often people will do these exposures for months or years, right? And then all of a sudden we will do an exposure, right? Or, face some kind of feared situation and then not do the safety behaviors, and the anxiety will diminish. And this click will happen with people that, oh, well, maybe I didn't need to do that, right? And I remember like when that happened with me, right? It was like I used to do all these kind of, religious routines because I was, so afraid that I was going to get possessed one day, right? When I was really, I was about 18, 19, I was really just lost in this like kind of fear. And then one day I just stopped doing them, right? Through this process of exposure and response prevention, I was, told to stop doing them. And then what happened is you didn't get possessed. I didn't get possessed. And then I realized that there was no actual correlation. It wasn't a possession issue, it was an anxiety issue, right? And that's the same thing. It's not that the plane was ever going to crash. It's not a plane crashing issue. It's an anxiety issue. And that connection we make, though, is why we justify living with anxiety, right? And there's a really good example of this to continue on this series of In Better Call Saul. And, I know I'm going to talk about this in this series as we move through, because it's a show that I'm watching right with my wife. And what we do oftentimes is we justify that because we feel something, it must be real, right? And so in Better Call Saul, like I explained in the last episode, Chuck has this fear of these electromagnetic fields, right? And he's just developed this belief that he's allergic to them. So when he's exposed to them, he goes into this like paralysis state. And what happens is he ends up getting hospitalized, actually. And he's in the hospital. He's laying there and he's being exposed to this light. And once they turn all the lights off, he talks about how he's fine. And the doctor's asking him, like, well, what's going on? And he starts explaining all his symptomology. And it's all the symptomology of anxiety, right? Well, I get a racing heart. I get a tingly sensation in my head and my skin. And I start breathing really fast. I get, it's like, so he starts explaining all these symptoms that he gets from his allergy. And it's actually a very clear explanation of anxiety, right? And the doctor like turns on this, electric plug, right next to him, and he doesn't know, and he has zero reaction to it. And the doctor, was essentially proving a point, like it's not actually an allergy; it's just in his mind, right? But he uses the feelings that he has as justification as to why his fear is real, and that's what a lot of us do, right? We say, well, you know what? I feel uncomfortable getting on a plane, so the plane must be a threat. Right? It must be dangerous. When the reality is it's the safest transportation available, right? And we do this with everything, right? Well, I feel anxious at night, so it must mean that I'm going to get fired, right? Or whatever it is that we're worried about, right? We use our feelings as justification to engage in our behaviors that then reinforce the anxiety. And when we get in that loop, what happens is the anxiety grows and grows and grows. And ultimately, again, our life becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And so what we have to do is realize that we have to often take that leap and challenge those behaviors we're doing and let the anxiety go down on its own. And that will allow that click to happen where you realize you don't need to be doing these behaviors. And again, in the show, there's this excellent example where Chuck's just walking, right? And he's kind of like consumed in this work he's doing, and he just walks outside without thinking, and he's standing at a car, and he kind of has this like realization moment where he's like, what am I doing? I'm out here, right? And it's something that he hadn't done in like, potentially months or years, right? He hadn't gone outside, and he just kind of does it. And then he realizes that he's safe out there. And he realizes all the behaviors that he's been doing actually weren't keeping him safe, right? He has this kind of almost epiphany moment, right? And that's really what anxiety treatment is about, right? It's about getting to that place where what we think our fear is or our danger, and realizing that all the things we think we're doing to prevent that, there's actually not a connection that's happening, right? It's the same way with someone who's afraid of, getting AIDS, right, from touching doorknobs, and they think that washing their hands is preventing them from getting AIDS. Well, they were never going to get AIDS, right? Like there's extremely low probability. And that connection they're making is what's reinforcing. So hopefully that's making sense. And so just to recap this episode, it's just, it's just this idea of we justify living with anxiety sometimes because we use a feeling-based judgment, one, and then we justify because the behaviors we're doing make us feel safer, right? And the reality is sometimes we have to challenge those behaviors and ultimately let the feelings and uncertainty go down on its own, and that's what will allow that breakthrough, right? And that really is the process of exposure and response prevention. So hopefully that makes sense, and just I encourage you to look at ways you might be justifying anxiety and OCD in your own life. And secondly, if this is something that you struggle with, I just want to let you know that we're here to help you. I mean, at restoredminds.com, we have resources, free assessments, free downloads, to help you on your journey to recovery, because this is what we do. This is what we specialize in. And so, we just want to say thank you so much for tuning in to the show. And we wish you a wonderful week. And we will see you next week as we continue this series on OCD and anxiety treatment. Take care.